Hi, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. My name is Robert Hayworth, and you're tuning in to the final in the series webinar of the Catapult Performance webinar series. We're very fortunate today to be joined by Ryan Horton of Georgia Tech, who's currently the Director of Applied Sports Science there, and Enrique Alonso, who is Intern Sports Scientist at Real Madrid Basketball. For those of you who have been on the webinars previously, we're following the same format, so it's approximately half an hour presentation. Ryan's going to be going first for us, and we do have the opportunity after each presentation to do some questions. So if you can just put your questions in the Q&A section as they come up, I'll do my best to kind of filter through and get those to the speaker as we come to the end of the session. So thank you again for joining. Without further ado, I'll pass you on to Ryan. Like, Ryan's got tons of experience in here, director of tons of different programs, S&C at Elon, assistant director at Florida International, and now working very closely with the Yellow Jackets football program as an applied sports scientist. So really lucky to have him on. He's going to be presenting on using Catapult to optimize summer training. So without further ado, I'll pass it on to Ryan.
Okay. Can you hear me? You hear me, Rob?
We've got you now. Yeah, I've got you. Sorry.
Okay,
so
perfect.
I'll pass the screen to you. I've just stopped sharing.
Okay. Let me pull this up real quick. Rob, appreciate it. Thanks to Rob and thanks to Catapult for the opportunity to be on and be able to share a little bit with you guys. But yeah, the topic is trying to optimize summer training. So kind of just to get into it a little bit. Well, actually, before I do that, let me see. I want to do my thank yous first. I know a lot of people do these at the end of their presentations. I kind of always like to do them at the beginning of the presentation because if not for a lot of the people on the screen right here, a lot of the names on the screen right here, I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing currently and wouldn't be giving the presentation that I'm currently giving. So first off, just to start off, Coach Collins, who's our head football coach here, not just because I want to, suck up to the head coach, but in all honesty, I mean, he hired me on at Georgia Tech. He actually Georgia Tech's never had a director of sports science for football before. He actually created the position to bring me here and do this. And I think, as most of us would probably attest to, that's probably on this call right now, our jobs are only as important as what the head coach makes it, right? So if you can be doing the best work in the world and getting tons of great information from the data and whatnot, but flat out, especially within American football, it may be a little bit different over in other countries, but if the head football coach isn't into it and he doesn't care and doesn't put importance on it, then all that's for naught. And I'm very, very blessed, very fortunate to have a head coach that's completely bought in to everything that we've been doing with Catapult and all the sports science stuff. So first and foremost, I want to thank him, and then that kind of extends to our whole Georgia Tech football staff, the football staff, the support staff. I'll speak a little bit more on the support staff in a minute, but all of our coaches have been super receptive and super bought into kind of what we're doing, which comes in great because when you have to have those conversations of, hey, we got to pull Johnny back a little bit in practice today. His acute chronic ratio is up or whatever, his explosive ratio is down, whatever the situation is. They've been super receptive to all of that and anything that we've been trying to implement. Which makes my job great. The next series of names. Joy Miller, which some of you on this call may actually know that name. She actually works for Catapult now. She was one of my first interns. But these are all either current or former interns of mine. Lori Schwartz, Nick LaRue, Brianna Prindle, Alyssa Vanez, and Savannah Chun. Cannot thank those people enough, past and present, because especially at the last school that I was at when I was kind of pulling double duty, some of the things, even simple things like just putting together daily reports and that kind of thing, I don't know how I would have been able to do it without their help. And then with some of the bigger projects that we're currently doing now at Georgia Tech, there's no way that I would have had enough time in the day to get to some of the stuff and deep dive into some of the stuff that I've been able to do without their help. So definitely want to mention them. And then the last line is Dave Feely, Roderick Moore, Johnny Long, Chris Stewart, and there's a ton of other names I could have put on here as well. But those are some former mentors of mine. Dave Feely was our head strength coach at Temple. Like I said, he could have made my job absolutely impossible to do when I was trying to be an assistant strength coach and I was trying to run all of our Catapult stuff. Those are 2 full-time jobs. I probably don't have to tell anybody on here that. And he was super understanding of when, if I had to leave the floor on a group and, get stuff downloaded or get reports ready for an afternoon staff meeting. He was always great about that. So Roderick Moore, former boss of mine, he was the head strength coach at FIU. He was also part of the Catapult team for a little while. And then Johnny was my first head strength coach when I was at Tennessee. And Chris Stewart was the associate guy there and has always been a great mentor of mine. So I appreciate you all indulging me for a minute on that. And then just wanted to give a little bit of my background. University of Tennessee for about 4 or 5 years, FIU for International for about 4 years as well, Elkland Sports Performance, which is a private facility in Virginia. Elon University was my first chance to be a head strength coach, and then Temple, and then currently at Georgia Tech. I put this up here for this reason, though. My background is strength and conditioning. So that's what I did for over 15 years, and I've kind of shifted and morphed into this role as director of applied sports science. But my knowledge, my background, my sensibilities still comes from the world of strength and conditioning. I mean, I still have, I'm sure there's a lot of people on this call right now that are way far more advanced than I am when it comes to the analytics side. I mean, I have interns right now that have been teaching me Power BI and Microsoft R and all that kind of stuff. But what I try to do with all the numbers and all the data is try to look at what can we look at that we can then apply, right? So what can we actually look at that can make changes within our process to make our process better, right? So a little bit about our setup at Georgia Tech before we get into the nuts and bolts. We've got our 4 tiers, if you will, strength and conditioning, which is headed up by Lou Coralla, who's our head strength coach. And then myself with sports science, athletic training, which is headed by Mark Smith. And then nutrition, which is headed up by Leah Thomas here at Georgia Tech. And again, just to go back to, how fortunate and blessed I feel to be where I'm at in the situation that I'm at, to have people that are totally on board, whether it's athletic training and working with Mark Smith with our return to play athletes and putting in protocols and applying some of the stuff on some of the feedback that we get from Catapult, to Coach Coralla with the strength and conditioning of kind of organizing what we do in the summertime, of how we do our runs, how much we're doing in our runs, different things like that. He kind of puts all that together, and then we kind of get together and work on kind of what makes sense from a number standpoint. The interns I've already talked about a little bit. But if you do not have a sports science internship program in place, you are thoroughly missing out. I would strongly advise anybody out there, especially, like I said, I know in American football, the position that I have is still pretty rare, to where I get to do just the sports science stuff with football. For most of us out there, you're in the situation that I was at Temple, where you're an assistant strength coach, or maybe you're an assistant athletic trainer, and you're trying to wear 2 hats. And there's never enough time in the day. There's barely enough time in the day to get the things that you have to get done. And generally, there's never enough time in the day to get to the things that you want to do on top of that. So having a sports science internship program, I think, is huge. Very selfishly, you get to look at a lot of things that maybe you wouldn't have otherwise gotten to look at. But in this field, and this field in general reminds me of strength and conditioning, if you go back 20 years of the level that it's expanding, how rapidly jobs are becoming available, and different schools are making this more part of their process. And so you can't learn Catapult and what it does, without being able to get hands-on and being able to do it. Sometimes I forget when I have new interns come in of just how overwhelming all of it can be at first, because you just get used to it after a while. And so for them to get that hands-on experience, to be able to then go and try to get jobs elsewhere, I think is huge for them as well. So we have 85 units. The question I get asked most often, the answer is yes, that is a lot. But you do get used to it. That's just kind of what we do now. And I don't think anything of having 85. We have one for every scholarship athlete, and then we have about a dozen walk-ons that have them. That number is a little bit higher in the spring before our new scholarship freshmen come in. But that's about where we're at. So now, with all that being said and all that out of the way, what I want to show you and share with you is some of our numbers and some of our data as we did a study and we looked at a summer conditioning session, a summer run versus a Tuesday practice versus a game. And what I wanted to see and what I wanted to dive into is what we're doing mimicking game demands. So is what we're doing in a Tuesday practice, is that the same movement patterns? Is that the same demands as what they're being asked to do in a game? And the same thing with the summer. Is the training that we're doing with them in the summer and the conditioning sessions, does the movement patterns match? Are we actually training our guys to do the things that they're going to be asked to do once we get to camp and once we get to practices? And so a couple of things that we looked at that I'm going to share with you is player load, total distance, just yardage covered, accelerations, and for the purpose of this today, they were level 2, level 3 accelerations. So basically anything over 3 meters per second squared. Max velocity. Max velocity is on here because our coaches really like to look at max velocity. Our kids really like to look at max velocity. I think it's one of the most useless things that we look at, but that's another topic for another day. But max velocity is on there. Sprints and sprint distance. So I know that by default, at least this used to be the case, I don't know if it still is, by default, Catapult kind of registers in anything over 12 miles per hour. We initially, when we first got this at Temple, thought that was a little low. So we arbitrarily bumped it to 14. That felt like a little bit more right. But that's kind of just an arbitrary number that we started tracking at the beginning. We've kind of just stuck with it. So sprints, quantity over 14 miles an hour, and then just sprint distance over 14 miles an hour. And then the last one was changes of direction. And then for the purposes of the presentation, I just combined the left and the right together. So just to give you a little bit of a background info on kind of what our summer workouts look like, what our Tuesday practices look like. So with our summer runs, what Coach Corrala does and what we do at Georgia Tech, I would say is very typical from what I've been around my entire career, being at different schools, different head strength coaches, doing it myself. We have a warm-up that runs, roughly 10 to 12 minutes. We break our guys up into 4 stations. And it could be change of direction drills. It could be cone drills. It could be short shuttles. It could be sprints. It could be a number of different things, bag drills, all the stuff that I think probably as American football, strength coaches and sports scientists, we all may do some things a little bit differently, but for the most part, your agility stations are your agility stations that are pretty much true across the board. We do competition, different variation sprints. Coach Carl is really big on these where we'll do, and maybe variation sprints where we're doing one sprint off of our stomach and one off our backs, maybe one for 10 yards, maybe a short shuttle. But we kind of do that by position groups just to add a little bit of competition. And we have our point system and that whole deal with guys that win sprints, win points for their team and all that kind of piece. Conditioning finisher at the end, that can vary. Half gassers could be like the 100-yard sprints, 10s, 20s, 30s, 40s. Varies each day, but some type of a conditioning component at the end. And then in the summertime, usually they'll finish off with maybe about 8 to 10 minutes of a player-led indie. So that's kind of a basic outline of kind of what our summer run would consist of, what it would look like, just to kind of give you a little bit of a background of kind of what that is. And then our Tuesday practice, that's our toughest practice of the week. I call it Tuesday, assuming that's a Saturday game, right? If you're playing on a Thursday night or a Friday night, that day actually might move. We call Tuesday practice, whether that's on a Saturday or whether it's on a Wednesday. it's still a Tuesday practice regardless of whatever the calendar says. That's our highest team player load for the week. So for team, I use a group of 44 guys. I don't use all 85 as far as for our team averages. And we're working anywhere from 90 to 95% of our game load in general from a team standpoint. So that gives you just a little bit of a background. So as I was putting this together, and we did these breakdowns for every guy across the board, 85 different guys. And so as I was trying to decide how I could best present this to where it would be digestible, kind of what I ended up going with was, I'm just going to give you a single guy that I kind of handpicked from a couple of different position groups. These are some of our dudes, if you will, some of our best players. But kind of what you see will vary a little bit from guy to guy based on position. But for the most part, it's pretty true across the board. And so as you look at it down the left side, those are the 7 categories that I went over a second ago. And then what an average summer session would look like, what an average Tuesday practice would look like throughout the season, and then what an average game looked like throughout the season. And so for each position, I'm going to highlight a couple of the categories that really kind of stuck out to me. And this was one of our wide receivers here. And the thing that hit me the most is I was kind of looking, especially between summer and in season, Tuesday practice and game load, pretty similar. And that's going to be kind of across the board. Our Tuesday practices, turns out they look like our games, which makes sense because we do a lot of team period stuff and we're doing 7-on-7 and team run and all that kind of thing. You would expect for that to look very similar, and it did. With the summer, player load is a little bit less, which that kind of makes sense because we were kind of ramping up in the season. And for the most part, most of the player loads are pretty consistent as far as what we were doing in the summer versus what we were doing in season. And a lot of that is by design. So player load is one of the things that this past summer we put a heavy emphasis on as far as having a plan in place starting in June, going from June through July into August, of how we were going to systematically ramp up our player load to where we can make that seamless transition into camp, to where it wasn't we hit July, then we hit camp, and all of a sudden there's this enormous spike in player load because camp has started and coaches are, antsy their pantsy to get out there and get after it, and players are ready to get after it, and you see this huge spike in player load. So to get enough of that base to work ourselves up to where that spike wouldn't happen, right? So we put a big emphasis on player load, but then when I went back afterwards and started breaking down and comparing and doing this little bit of a study, it was interesting to see the differences in where that player load was coming from. So again, if you look at the distance, half the amount of distance from the summer to a Tuesday, right? I mean, literally almost half. But if you look at sprint distance, it's over double, right? So we're doing a ton of sprinting. We're doing a ton of running. We're doing way more than they do in season, and way more than they're being asked to do in a game. This really struck me. And as I get to the cornerback example here in a second, very similar as well. But what struck me is interesting was, as a strength and conditioning coach, if I walk into a room of strength coaches and say, hey, you know what we need to better prepare our players for practice? We need to go out and we need to run a mile. I would get laughed out of the room, right? I would laugh myself out of the room if I came up. And I'm not saying take your football players out and go run miles. By no means am I saying that, like it's back in 1995 and we do the mile run condition test. It's not what I'm saying. But let me flip over to the corner so you can see them as well. Again, if you look at the total distance that those skill guys are running, it's half. I mean, that's actually literally less than half of what this corner was doing in a summer session compared to what he was doing in a Tuesday practice. Accelerations are pretty close. Sprint distance, 474 yards versus 144. Now, his game goes up a little bit more, and a little bit of the difference in that, which I'll kind of try to speak to a little bit in a minute. he was a special teams guy, right? This is one of our gunners as well. So while we don't do tons of reps of gunner where he's having to do the full cover, you know, in a game he is. So that's a little bit of the discrepancy there. And then I'll get into this a little bit more in a second, but the changes of direction, especially for the defenders, you know, we were doing half in the summertime, and that's going to become even more apparent as we get into some of these other position groups. And let me go ahead and pop into the running back. So running back, player loads pretty close. Total distance, a little bit of a discrepancy, not quite as much. But the biggest difference, the change of direction is the one that really jumped out at me on this one. And then the sprint distance, you know, triple what he would do in a Tuesday practice and almost 10 times as much as what he would do in a game. And this one I found interesting because, and I'm guilty of this myself, because of running backs' ability, we put them into position groups with the wide receivers and the DBs. You know, typically that's your skill group: running backs, wide receivers, DBs, and we have them do similar type things. But when you look at what they actually do in practice or even in a game, it's nowhere near the same. The changes of direction they do is double, triple what those other skill positions do, and the amount of sprint distance that they actually get. Your sprint distance, especially in a game, is based off opportunity. And that's not based off ability. Do you have the opportunity to get past the line of scrimmage, get into the second level, and be able to get out and actually, you know, accelerate and hit those higher velocities? And so this was one of the ones that we really sat down. Okay, we need to rethink a little bit of kind of how we approach our running backs and some of our other positions. Getting into linebackers, I told Rob at the start, and he was like, "Yeah, 30-minute presentation." I'm like, "Oh yeah, 30 minutes. I talk fast. I'll probably be way under it." And now I'm looking at the time, and I'm seeing more creeping close. So, Rob, I'm trying to keep it close to that window. So,
no problem. No.
So, with the linebacker that I used, he's a little bit of an anomaly himself. He would put up our highest distance covered in games. He would have our highest player load typically in games. He was still the best example that I had because a lot of our other linebackers, there was, you know, guys fighting for starting positions and reps, and that kind of went back and forth with some guys, and some guys kind of moving and tweaking positions just a little bit. So as far as a linebacker that was consistently in that position and consistently playing, this was my guy. But again, similar to the running backs, it was the changes of direction, right? It was the total volume of yardage, right? And then change of direction. We had to get more change of direction. We need to get more change of direction in, and we need to figure out a way to get a little bit more volume on their legs without it becoming an issue of having too much volume. And then with him in particular, our linebackers, one of the things we did notice on a Tuesday is those guys, we're playing those guys in a phone booth in practice and maybe need to get out and extending them a little bit sprinting wise. Now as we get into the big guys, it becomes even more drastic, right? We're talking about, I've got an offensive line example, a defensive tackle example, and I know as strength coaches that I've kind of been around, we've always talked, and I say we because, again, I mean, I still think of myself as a strength conditioning coach. We've always talked about, okay, we need to train these guys differently, right? And we make small changes, I think, to train them differently. We have intentions of doing that. But when I actually ran the numbers of, okay, well, here's what we do with these guys in the summer, and here's what they do in practice, it was startling. The amount of accelerations, I mean, that's a lot of times that is, you know, putting your hand behind the line and taking off. 20 of those in the summer, but for an offensive lineman, that's just not something that they do. They don't do that in practice. They don't do that in games. Sprint distance, 76 yards, not a ton, but again, if you look at practice, nilch. You know, I think there was a little bit of something there, but it rounded down to 0. But on the other hand, change of direction. And we were getting 4 of those on average in the summertime, and on a Tuesday practice, 5 times that, and in a game, almost 8 times that. And the D tackle was kind of similar. A lot of accelerations, a lot of sprintings. This is one of our more athletic D tackles. probably, if we're being honest, a little bit undersized. But the discrepancy between the amount of sprinting, acceleration, sprint distance versus the amount of change of direction was really, really intriguing, really interesting. So kind of the overall takeaways, can't just look at player load, right? I mean, if you're going to try to train these guys and mimic these movement patterns of what you're doing with them in the summertime versus what they're going to be needing to be ready to do in the fall, it's got to go beyond that. I mean, how much are you accelerating? How much total volume sprinting are you doing? How much total volume in general are you doing? All of those things is something, and I would not recommend, if you have, 40 units or 85 units, I wouldn't necessarily recommend trying to go in and do every single guy. But if you pick, your 6 guys or your dozen guys and that are your guys, and kind of track them as you're going through the summertime and start to compare that to what they do in the fall, it can be a game changer. I know it's completely changed up our thought process, at least before we were in the situation that we are in now. But sprint distance versus total distance discrepancies in the summer versus season. Why? So I have a little bit of a theory onto why our sprint distance is so high in the summertime versus total distance and what we do actually in the fall. Part of that is a little bit logistical, right? You've got care hours and you've got 8 hours a week in the summertime, and you got to get it in and you got to get your bang for your buck, so to speak. Whereas in practice, you've got a longer time duration for practice. But as strength coaches, and we like to be able to quantify things, right? Like we like 110s, we like half gassers, we like these things that we can time and see if guys pass or see if they fail. So then we can stamp them, and say, okay, well, he passed the conditioning test, this guy didn't pass the conditioning test, and it's a lot easier to time a half gasser where a guy has 18, 20 seconds than it is. I don't know how many of you out there have ever tried to time 10s and 20s, right? But if you're doing that for a conditioning standpoint and, okay, well, you've got 3 seconds, well, you were at 3.1 seconds, so you missed that rep. Well, that doesn't really work practically, right? But the longer stuff, we can time that stuff. And I knew when I was a head strength coach, I took that stuff personally as well. I mean, that was kind of one of the ways that I felt like I justified kind of my job and justified what I was doing in the summertime, was whether or not all my guys passed the conditioning test at the end of the summer. I mean, that was personal to me. And that was something that was not only emphasized by me, but it was emphasized by the coaching staff as well, just by the mere fact that on a typical normal summer run, maybe 1 or 2 of the position coaches would come out and watch and see what was going on. But man, when it was in the summer and it was the conditioning test day, it was everybody on staff. And so it's like anything else. I mean, you're going to get good at, what you emphasize. You're going to get good at what you practice. And so what we were getting good at, is sprinting these extended distances. And so, but when I look back on it now and I'm thinking, well, was that actually the right thing to do? Was I actually, doing the things that we actually really needed? A lot of times you hear, well, there's a difference between summer shape, right? And there's a difference between playing shape. You get into condition and you do all this running, but then you got to get into playing shape. Well, what is that? Is that really just the fact that we're asking you now to do different things? And so there's different demands on your body. And when there's different demands on your body, that's a different kind of conditioning. And so that goes to the next line, more emphasis on change of direction in the summer. That's something that jumped out at us. And we realized we do change of direction in the summer. I mean, we do, the cone drills and the reaction drills and all those different things, all that different change of direction. One of the things we thought of is, okay, are we giving them enough rest time to be able to do the change of direction work at a high enough intensity? Or are we getting them in such a fatigued state because we are go in the summer that we're not allowing them to have enough rest to then get that high intensity change of direction, right? Where it becomes kind of work, right? Instead of that high intensity work that's going to translate. The good part about it was as we start looking at all these different position needs, then you start having to look at the logistical side of it. And especially if you have a smaller staff of, okay, well, we need to train all these guys differently. How is that going to work? What is that going to look like? But the good part is what we saw was it kind of falls into position groups. Like your skill guys are going to look different. Their demands are going to look different, but they're going to look similar. Combos are going to look different than the skills in the bigs, but they're similar. And the same thing with the bigs. So, we at least places that I've been, we typically break those groups up into skill combo big anyway. You may have different names for it. But your times on your runs are different for skill combo bigs. One of the things that I've seen too, I've used a little bit as well is, well, our skill guys are going to run 110s, our combos are going to run 100s, and our bigs are going to run 90s, because we're going to save that distance off of our bigs. We're going to save their legs by having them run 20 less yards. Sounds great in theory. I've been a proponent of that at one point in my life as well. But when you actually do the breakdown of the numbers, that's still nowhere close to what they're actually doing in the game. So how can we make it more, more specific to what they're actually going to be needing to do? As you're looking at your numbers, especially as you're looking at the Tuesday numbers, you're looking at the game numbers, and you're comparing back to summertime, keep in mind your special teams demands, is a guy that's a little bit of an anomaly here or there. Well, is that guy a punt guy? Is he a punt return? Is he a kickoff return? Is he a 3 special team guy? Keep that in mind as you're trying to compare numbers back and forth. That some of those guys may look different for those reasons. And then also, your results may be completely different depending on what I have. I would strongly, if you haven't done this already, a lot of you may have already done something similar to this, but if you haven't, I would strongly encourage it. But you can use mine as kind of a starting point, but your results may be completely different based on your offensive and defensive schemes, based on your tempo of schemes or your practice styles. Do you have a more up-tempo practice? Do you have a slower practice? Keep that in mind as well. And then, finally, kind of what's it all mean for this summer, right? There was and I wish I could have found it and gave credit to whoever put it out, but there was a tweet that I saw that I really liked about a week ago, and it was something to the effect of, you can't try twice as hard and have a baby in 4.5 months, right? A baby's going to take 9 months. You can't just, well, we're going to try harder, we're going to push harder, we're going to be able to get it done faster. And I think there's going to be a huge rush to get, if we end up having, 6 weeks is kind of what is being thrown around a lot, as far as maybe a 4-week camp and a 2-week prep period before that camp. And of us trying to get in, this past 3 months into that 6 weeks. And especially for us, if we, as strength conditioning sports scientists, if we only have 2 weeks before we actually start putting pads on, of trying to, sprint these guys like crazy to start with. I would say, look at what your actually demands are. Do you need to go out and start running a whole bunch of half gassers or have a conditioning test when everybody comes back? I just don't think that's smart. I think get your guys in and get them working, get the volume onto their legs. We don't need to be trying to run anybody into the ground. One, it's not what they're going to do in practice. They're not going to have 500 sprint distance yards in practice or a game. So there's no need for us to do that, straight out the gate. It reminds me also of, Johnny Long, who's my first head strength coach. He asked me one time when I was at Tennessee, we would have our warm up, and then we may have some speed work, and then we would go lift, and we'd come out and do a little bit of running afterwards. But we would have 4 sessions a week. They were 2 hours long. And he asked me one time, when I was a young coach, and he said, "Hey, Ryan, why do you think that we train the way we train? Why do you think we go out and we train for 2 hours and we do that like we do?" And, being the young strength coach, and I wanted to, impress with all my knowledge, and, I start talking about central nervous system and all these kind of things. And then he kind of stopped me. He said, "Nope." He said, if they can work for 2 hours with us, right, whether that's lifting or running or whatever it is, if they can work for 2 hours with us, and get used to getting through that, then they can go work for 2 hours on the football field to practice. And I mean, that's never left me. I mean, that was almost 20 years ago. And, I thought that was incredibly insightful. But just, start working on trying to get the volume onto these guys. Use your acute chronic ratios, use all the tools at your disposal. But we don't need to try to cram 2 months into 2 weeks. And that's kind of it. That's what I got. That's my contact info. That's my email. That is my work cell, which I have sitting right beside me right now. Please feel free, whether it's anything that I just spoke about, or if you've got any questions on really anything, if there's anything that I can help with, shoot me a text, give me a call. That's my Twitter at the bottom. Shoot me an email. Love to talk shop, and would love to be a resource and be able to help out anybody any way that I can. So that's my piece, Rob. Appreciate it. Appreciate the opportunity for having me on and getting to share a little bit of what we do.
Thank you very much, Ryan. I guess I'll speak on behalf of everybody. It's always good to see a presentation from my point of view anyway, where you get to see some of the data that people are actually collecting, and it's good to see you walk us through kind of your thoughts and ideas around this training. And actually really interesting from my personal perspective, because almost within soccer, it feels like we have the opposite problem. We play a lot of small-sided games, or they're really tight. Nobody gets any high-intensity distance and sprint distance. So the challenge for us was always the opposite, to open up the pitches, to make things bigger and reduce the number of changes of directions and allow people the opportunity to sprint. So it's interesting to see that you've got the opposite challenge of trying to change that side of things. I guess a question just from myself to start off with. I know you mentioned the situation that we find ourselves in, and you guys are looking at potentially trying to cram a lot of training into a short window. And you mentioned potentially not trying to cram, if anything, doing what you would normally do and get the volume into the players. Is there any kind of structure that you think you'll take, and is there anything that you'll do kind of differently? Do you think you'll focus, as you say, on change direction? Like how would you implement those changes in terms of change direction into that shortened preseason?
Yeah, it's a good question. And so some of the things, so we started already incorporating some of the things that we learned by breaking these numbers down when we got into our mat drills, winter workouts, whatever your term is for the workouts that we do leading up into spring ball. And so some of the things that we did was, it's obviously from a drill selection standpoint, to work in more of those change of direction drills. We're also coming to grips with, it's okay if we get an extra 2-minute break or 3-minute break right here. I think, as strength coaches, as soon as we see, people standing around, it's almost like a panic that sets in. Like, well, we're standing around, we can't be doing this. We need to be moving. We need to be sprinting. We need to be doing this. It's okay. Give guys a couple minutes and then get some good high intensity work in. And we've also started to incorporate kind of small little tweaks, spacing our drills out a little further apart, just to get a little bit of volume in. And then playing around with things like, okay, instead of doing instead of having your drills, let's say, for instance, instead of having your drills 30 yards apart, and we get done with the drill, and the horn blows or the whistle blows, and now I sprint to the next station, right? I think a lot of us probably do something similar like that. So we started incorporating little tweaks like skipping a station kind of as we went. So if let's say there's 4 stations set up. So instead of going from station 1 to station 2, when the horn blows, I go from station 1, I go around station 2, and I end up in station 3. And we kind of do a rotation where we kind of skip stations as we rotate. It's not quite as a high intensity sprint, but it's just a way to kind of sneak in volume. And it's kind of the same way my wife gets me to eat broccoli. She kind of just sneaks it into things without me really noticing. And just trying to, incorporate little tweaks like that to be able to get the numbers to kind of match up a little bit better.
Nice. Well, I should have said at the start of this as well, for anybody who's listening, if you do have any questions, fire it into the Q&A. I know Ryan's been great there. You've got loads of resources in terms of being able to call him and tweet him and email. But if you do have a question, feel free to fire it in. We got one during the presentation, which I'm not sure whether this was right or not, but did you say that you, at the moment, you have 44 devices on your athletes for your team averages?
So what I do, so we have 85 units total. But when we look at things like team averages, for team averages, I have a group of basically our 2 deep on both sides of the ball. So for team averages, if we're looking at like, our general, we look at each individual guy, we've got, acute chronic ratios and everything all the way down the line for each guy that we do with each guy. But from a generality standpoint, when we're looking at team averages from whether it's session to session or whether it's a practice session, we have certain markers that we like to hit as far as from a team standpoint. And for that, we use a group of 44, which is essentially our 2D. So basically all it's doing, it's eliminating the guys basically probably on your scout teams, your redshirt freshmen, out of your kind of averages for practice and for games or whatnot. So 85 total units. We use all of those units. We look at each guy individually, but for looking at our team averages, so to speak, I use a group of 44.
Okay, perfect. I think that answers the question. And then there's another one coming here around, I guess, a question around whether or not you've used maximum aerobic speed running to try and combat some of the high speed distance, but again, get that utilization of the kind of stimulus that you want to achieve, I guess, from your training.
We've not done that, but something we could look into for sure.
Yep, that's all right. If anybody has got any other questions, feel free to fire in. I guess another one from myself, maybe before we close up. Obviously, we saw quite a lot of the work that the guys are doing there in terms of the sprinting, the distances, the player loads. Are there any metrics that you guys take to try and understand how the players individually have reacted to the loads that you've placed on the players?
We do. So we do questionnaires. Mm-hmm. And basically the way that I look at questionnaires is kind of a conversation starter. That's kind of how I look at it. One of the best things about my role now, of not having to try to be, a strength coach that has, a whole nother 12 hours a day of responsibilities, is it gives me time, it gives me a little bit more freedom to be able to have more of those, individual conversations with guys. So I had probably the simplest, most basic questionnaire on the planet. It was just like a little 5-question questionnaire. And then I would have, I had about 15 guys that would text me each morning, their numbers and their answers. And like I said, that would be when I had one of my interns that would then put all those numbers in. But when I would get the text in, those were a way that I looked at as having a conversation starter where, most guys are going to give you similar numbers, for each question for the most part. But when you have your guys that are your hard workers and your high character guys and you trust to be honest and tell you the truth, and all of a sudden, if it's a 1 through 5, let's say soreness, and their soreness, they usually give you a 4, and all of a sudden one day they give you a 2, it gives you a chance to, hey, what's going on, what's happening, and be able to have that conversation because, the RPEs and that feedback is great. But to me, the context is even better. Is, okay, what are you feeling? Why are you feeling it? And then how can we incorporate that and see how that matches up with what the numbers are saying?
Yeah, definitely. No, makes sense. Well, thank you very much, Ryan. I don't think we've got any other questions through. So as you can see on the screen, you've still got his details. So feel free to reach out. And thank you very much again for joining us, Ryan, and sharing all your experiences and data with us.
Appreciate it, Rob. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, so if you could stop sharing your screen there, Ryan. I might be able to do it.
I'm sorry.
Oh, that's all right.
I get yelled. Yeah, I get yelled at that all the time.
No problem. So, whilst just introducing Enrique, if you want to share your screen, perfect. And so, next up, as I said earlier, Enrique, well, fortunate enough to have Enrique Alonso with us, who's an intern sports scientist with Real Madrid basketball. And he's going to be presenting, as you can see on screen, the practical applications of data in basketball. Without further ado, I'll pass you on to Enrique. Hopefully he can speak at this point, but I look forward to seeing the presentation.
Thanks, Rob. Hello, everybody. First of all, thanks to Rob, thanks to Catapult for inviting me. For me, it's a pleasure to be here today. They told me that if I could explain how we apply data in the lab, and if I could give some real practical applications. So this is the index. I have split the webinar in 3 stages. A little bit introduction with some tips that I consider important, practical applications, and conclusions. So I will start with this picture that was viral in Twitter 1 year ago. And I think that it's important to take under consideration the differences between data, information, and knowledge. We know that data alone is noise. For example, this player ran 3 kilometers, or this player scored 20 points, or yesterday 100 of people died because of coronavirus. It does not say anything. But if we provide context, we got information. For example, this player has scored 20 points, that suppose 10 points more than usual. Or today have died 50% less than yesterday because of coronavirus. So after that, if you have mistakes and experimentation, we got experience. And this experience with information is knowledge. And when we are humble and try to have a growing mind, this knowledge will be transformed in wisdom. So in a simple view, this is how I consider that should be the process for people who work with data. In collaboration with the rest of the staff, we try to identify and determine the priority problems to solve. And as a sports scientist, I try to manage the expectations and say, yes, it's possible or not worth it, or it's not possible yet, we need more data. So after ask the right question, we should determine a robust methodology. What I mean with that, so for example, if we use RPE to monitor internal load, and one day we collect it 30 minutes after the practice, the next day the question has changed, or the athletes don't have education, we will collect unreliable data, and we will store unreliable data, we will analyze unreliable data, and we will take a decision based in unreliable data. So in our process, we must ensure a reliable decision-making process, knowing the range of error. And the last stage is determine the best solution or get the information in the right way. And in this part, I think that it's very important to have good communication, understand the context, and speak the same language than the person who we are reporting. Sometimes we are reporting something to the coach and he's not understanding us because we are using a graph that he has never seen before, or we are using a specific language that coaches don't understand. So my advice is that the less is better. Sometimes we want to give our reports with a lot of information, and the coaches don't read it. So I recommend less and quality information, easy to remember for the coach or fitness coaches. The best thing that could happen is that coach asks for more information. So oh nice, this is so interesting, but we could know that, or how is about that? Is the best that could happen. This slide so powerful tools for people, for example, like me, who don't have deep knowledge about computer programs or create language codes with RStudio or Python or whatever. So I recommend you Tableau or Power BI. These platforms provide powerful tools for aggregating, analyzing, visualizing, and sharing data. And I also recommend this website from Data to Bit. It's a website with information about most appropriate graph for your data. So if you're interested in how to analyze data in an easy way, I recommend you take a look. And another aspect before to start that I consider important is that we need to understand and the sport and performance from an holistic perspective. We need a little bit knowledge about strengths. We need to know different training strategies, to know the sport, visualization. In my opinion, this horizontal knowledge will let us to have a better understanding about what is happening, and we will be better professionals. So as take-home message of this intro, first, start with the right question. Second, robust methodology. Remember that it's important to know what are we measuring and the range of error. And finally, good communication. Less is better, and the best that could happen is that the coach asks for more information. So in the main part of this webinar, I will try to explain how we can use data to have a better understanding about game demands, understand how we train and how we can optimize the training process, some considerations and dashboard that we use in the load monitoring process, and some examples with performance stats. So here we can see the nature of basketball. In our 18 team players, players cover during a game, including warm up, around 5 kilometers, more or less. It depends on the time that a player is on court, it's obvious. So we see that it's not a lot. Everybody is able to run 3 kilometers, but not everybody is able to cope the basketball demands. As we can see, we almost invest the 80% of the time walking or jogging, and the another 20% that tend to be transitions and fast breaks. We are running over 15 kilometers per hour. That is not as fast as we could think. So for this reason, we know that basketball is an explosive sport where there are continuous changes of direction, jumps, sprints, acceleration, deceleration, contact, and specific sport skills. For example, we can see that over 18 kilometers per hour, players cover 5 meters maximum per effort. So players don't need much velocity. The size court is small, and players need power, explosive acceleration, and the ability to repeat high intensity effort. What else we know about game demands? We have seen, and there are some research that support it. Its intensity is decreasing during the game in almost every parameter: high speed, distance, acceleration, deceleration, player load. So we could say that the highest intensity tends to be during the first quarter, but we know that more research is necessary because we don't know if the lowest demands during the last quarter are because of fatigue or are a consequence from the score line or other tactical reason. So we should clarify it, but it seems that the highest intensity tends to be during the first quarter. And another way to understand game demands is from a worst case scenario perspective, and why I think that, in my opinion, it's important, because understanding game demands using average drastically underestimates the most intense moments. So, for example, if the average distance that a player covered during a game is 90 meters per minute, that means that sometimes he's covered 55 meters in a minute and another 130 meters. So to optimally prepare athletes for the most demanding periods or peak demands or worst case scenario, it's important that athletes are trained to cope the specific demands of the most demanding periods of the game and not just average demands. So how can we apply this, or when? So as I said before, we know that basketball is a rapid high intensity effort sport, and we know that these efforts are in different planes. Savage Selling proposed this, which one I totally agree. And the first, the basics: limitation in rhythm of movement, pull, push, activation, squats. Then quality movement. Players need to need good biomechanical patterns, quality during running, landing, jumping, and then is where I could include tasks where players interchange these peak demands with multiple movements, unpredictable contests, and finally apply it in a specific offense and defense situation. So how could we apply the concept of the most demanding periods during training sessions, depending on the orientation, games per week, individual strengths, tolerance, and objectives? We should find a way to expose players to the most demanding periods. Or another application could be with unselected players or fringe players. It would be interesting to replicate the most demanding periods in order to balance their workload. One solution, for example, could be interval training, in which players interchange intensity based on average demands with high intensity effort, simulating the most intense external demands and including, as I said before, multiplying movements and unpredictable contests. And in this way, players could accumulate the desired volume and be exposed to the most demanding periods of the game. And another application could be during return to train or return to play process. Players should be exposed to most demanding periods before return to sport. So as a take-home message of this part, we know that basketball is so complex, and we have to try to understand game demands from different perspectives, and we should find different ways to prepare players according to his specific profile to cope the dynamic system, most demanding periods, volume, intensity, density, and mental, technical, tactical requirements. So what's about practice? Here we can see how we understand the different physical orientation of the drills, physiological running-based demands. Coaches understand better metabolic orientation or cardiovascular orientation. And in this type of exercise, players tend to cover high speed distance and more distance, and biomechanical load. Drills which provide more acceleration, deceleration jumps, and explosive force. So I'm gonna show you just the exercise battery from second team. We have another one for the first team, but it's important to understand that, for example, if tomorrow a new coach is coming, we will not use the same battery because it's so specific depending on the philosophy of the coach. So here we can see the most common exercise, or the exercise that our coaches tend to use. On the left top, the exercise with physiological running based demands orientation and high intensity. We could consider high intensity as more heart rate or more player load per minute. On the top right, the high intensity biomechanical exercise, which provide more acceleration, deceleration, explosive force. And below on the right, we can see ball drills, soft exercise, which tend to be lower in intensity, but they have still a biomechanical load predominance. But we had to take into account that, and we know that there are different external factors that can modify the physical orientation. It's not the same, for example, an exercise on full core than half core, or an exercise with the presence or absence of the coach. So depending on the physical orientation that we want for the training session, we should take under consideration all these factors. So, for example, if we have a 5 versus 5 exercise, and we include competition, dribbling limitation, for example, just one dribbling or one dribbling, we will change a physiological running-based exercise into a biomechanical orientation. So, as I said before, it's important to understand that if things change, the coach or you, for example, could not use the same battery in your team because it's so specific depending on the training philosophy of the coach. So here we can see how we distribute the physical orientation depending on the day. With the first team, the priority is technical-tactical, and we hardly have time to train. But with the under 18 team, depending on the day, we recommend to the coach different exercise to provide different physical orientation to avoid or to try to avoid monotony. So in our contest, we played 2 games per week, Saturday and Sunday, because we play in 2 different competitions. So Monday, we tend to have biomechanical orientation. We include short exercise, ball drills, small side games in half core. Tuesday and Thursday are the day where we have the highest volume and intensity with a running-based exercise. And Friday tend to be the most specific day with 5 versus 5 and short exercise, and it's a mix between physiological and biomechanical orientation. So here we can see an scatter plot. In the x-axis, with we see the real-time data player invests on core, and on the y-axis we see player load. And we can see how the match day on the left is the shortest activity, and we see how match day is not on the top. So we see how a game, including warm up, suppose similar or less volume than training sessions. So when we see it relative per minute, we see how the match day is on the top left. That means that games suppose more intensity than practice. That we have seen, and I will go into detail about this later, is that when we play a tournament, for example, 6 games in 5 days, we accumulate between 15–30% less of volume than typical week with 4 practice and 2 games. So the number of activities is the same, but 4 practice and 2 games provide more volume from an external load perspective than 6 games. So if in our under 18 contest we compare training versus game, we see how a volume for every parameter is higher during training sessions in blue than games in orange. So if we see it relative per minute, we can appreciate that the only parameter that is higher during games is distance per minute, but acceleration, deceleration, high speed distance, and explosive effort are higher during training. So as we can see, it will depend on the type of practice and how much time a player invests on the court during a game. But in general, in this specific contest, for almost every player, a practice support more external workload than a game. That it's the thing. But if we jump to the first team, there are some differences. From a volume perspective, we just trained 50 minutes. With the under 18 team was 90. So from a volume perspective, training and practice are similar to practice real time is shorter than 18, as I said. So if we see it relative per minute, we can appreciate that distance and high speed distance too are higher during games, and acceleration, deceleration, explosive effort are higher during training. So here it's so different, and we have a lot of variability depending on the role. So for example, for players who play more than 22 minutes box score time, right, including warm up, the external load will be higher during a game than during a practice. For players who play around 15 minutes, will be similar. And for unselected players, it's obvious that practice supposes more external workload than a game. So we should take under consideration, and as I explained before, fringe or unselected players should do additional training to compensate the workload. So what we have seen is that the main differences between first and under 18 team is that under 18 team have more volume and intensity during practice. And it's obvious because the audiences are different. And the second difference that we have seen is the trips, the travels. The first team play 2 or 3 games per week, and they are traveling every week. So here is the question, and the answer will depend on a lot of factors, but we know that volume is similar during games and practice, and we know that coaches like to have all players available to play or train, but we should consider that there are a lot of games and practice, and sometimes we need to provide to the player total rest, especially taking care in mental fatigue. So we should take under consideration the advantage and disadvantage of each option, but if we provide rest to a player during a game away, in NBA we couldn't, but in Europe we can. So if we do, player won't travel, and here we have total rest, mental and physical, but we know that when we play away, it's more difficult to win. If we provide rest during a practice and the player stays at home, he does not miss a game, and it's total rest too. And if we provide rest during a game at home, if players have to stay on the court anyway without playing the game, without mental recovery, worth it. So we should consider all these factors because of with 2 or 3 games per week, practice and travels, players sometimes need total mental rest. Invest time with family, with himself, and with friends. What's about load monitoring? You can see here the early monitoring cycle proposed by Tim Gabbett. External workload, what did the player do? Internal workload, what is the player response to the load? Well-being, is the player coping with the load? And readiness, is the player prepared to train or play? Whatever you use, it has to be cost-benefit and easy to implement. In our context, we do it simple, and we actually just use Catapult devices to monitor external load, RPE for internal load, and we try, especially fitness coaches, to have a lot of communication with players as how they feel. So here you can see one example of our session report. I consider that it's important to understand if we have got the workload that we have planned to have before the practice began. We have the report available 15 minutes after practice, more or less, and we try to understand always how was the load for a player comparing with himself for a specific contest. So for example, a player ran 3 kilometers, that is 20% more than usual in match day +2. We use percentage because it's easier to understand to the coaches, but we could use standard deviations, set scores, or whatever that let us to understand the change. Here you can see the efficiency scatter plot that Tim Gabbett proposed. In x-axis external load, and in y-axis internal load. And it let us to understand how the players respond to the load. Here we can see a real example. For example, in blue, we can see the players with high external and internal load. It was on Thursday, match day -2. So it was a hard session. It's not surprise. But in red, we have 2 players which have less external load than usual for this specific type of day. But internal load was high. So this could be an alert, and we should see more data of previous days, and we should speak and ask player how he feels. Here we can see the acute chronic ratio dashboard. It's a hot topic now, but we still use it. We use uncoupled and exponential weighted moving average, and in an easy way, we are able to understand the acute chronic load. And for example, if we select a specific player, we can understand the load in the last week, the 2 days before, 3 weeks before, and understand where is the data confirmed. Another metric that we use is the weekly change that lets us to understand, to avoid spikes over 15%. And here we have another type of visualization that let us to understand the change against oneself from a longitudinal perspective. For example, these days, almost all players have higher load than the individual median for each specific type of day. And if we select a specific player, it's easier to understand how was the individual load. For example, in this specific case, this player had 5 consecutive days higher load than himself for each specific type of day. And the last application, it's about how can we apply data in performance stats. Here in Europe, we don't have as data as in NBA or NCAA, but from box score, from play-by-play and shot chart, we are able to get the data and advanced stats that we need to answer coach questions. So if you are interested in advanced stats, I recommend you read this book. The first thing that Dan Oliver recommend is that we should understand the key performance indicators depending on the league where our team is competing. And furthermore, we have to know what information coaches need from us. And the majority of the times, they don't know, and this process is so difficult. Coaches want value information, but they don't want to think what information they need, or the information that they want is not possible to get, or it could take a difficult process or a lot of time. So here we see an easy sample of a scouting report. This shows the result in the last 10 games. The 2 teams most common, and here coaches can understand, or are able to understand how the team finished the possession. In this example, for example, in a 33% of the possession, the team finished with a 3-point shot. There are the 14 in the league. Or for example, they don't tend to shot a lot of free throws. There are the 15. Here, another example, the typical scatter plot that shows the efficiency, offensive net rating and defensive net rating. To the right means better offensive net rating, and lower means better defensive net rating. Inside the red square, we see the best teams in offensive net rating. Offensive net rating means how many points the team scored by 100 possessions, and in green, the best teams in defensive net rating. That defensive net rating means as many points a team received by 100 possessions. Another example, for example, this scatter plot let us understand the offense efficiency on the top right means better true shooting and points per shot, and we see as is logical that they are correlated, and we can understand which players are more offensive, has more offense efficiency. Or for example, in this graph, we see as more on the right, more percentage of use, that consider how many times a player finishes the possession while it's on the court. So in red, we see a player who has the highest percentage of use, but he's not efficient because he scored 0+5 points per shot. And in green, we see the most efficiency player, but he's the 7th on the team in percentage of use. It's important to consider that we have to take into account that we can know if increasing his use, he will keep his efficiency. So to finish, first, we can use data to get useful information to support the coaches, players, fitness coaches to enhance performance, optimize performance, and reduce risk of injury. The second one, and in my opinion, is so important, and we don't have to forget early education. From childhood, we must be focused in education, in habits, because it will determine the way. And And after the older the player is, the harder is the change their bad habits. So it's important to start from childhood. And to finish, I put this picture and I love it. And a quote from Marcus Aurelius that say, everything we hear is an opinion, not a fact. And everything we see is a perspective, not the truth. So, in my opinion, we should try to understand the things in performance from different perspectives. So thanks again to Catapult, to Rob for letting me to be here today. I hope that was useful for you. And if you have any question, I'll be happy to try so. So thanks.
Thank you very much, Enrique. As Enrique says, if you do have any questions, fire them into the Q&A and I'll do my best to work through them. Another very insightful presentation, and yeah, a lot of take-home points there, so a lot to digest for everybody. And yeah, I also like that quote that you put up at the end there. So it's very. I think it's a lot of people do end up in that danger zone, really, of using the data to back up opinions, and it can almost be an objective measure that you use to back up your subjective opinion. So yeah, very interesting. One of the questions that has come in from Sebastian is around the kind of internal load measures. I think you said that you do RPE at the moment, and he had a question just around I guess why you don't use heart rate at the moment, or whether or not you do use heart rate.
Yeah, it's a good question. Because the pets need an special care, and we can't guarantee first of all to wash it to the temperature that we need and in the condition that Catapult say, so we can use the vest. And furthermore, players tend to wear the vest at the shirt, so it's not in contact with the skin. So we can't, and sometimes in the real practice it's difficult to say to the player that he has to wear the vest touching his skin. So this is the reason why we just use RP.
Perfect. And then I guess from my perspective, if you what do you feel like has been your biggest learning point from your time at Real Madrid? Obviously, it's I think you said it was your first kind of professional full-time role. Is there any kind of advice that you give to anybody else in a similar situation to yourself coming into that role as to what you've learned in that very short period of time?
In my opinion, I think that the most important thing is on the first days, stay without saying anything, just looking, just learning what they use, what they tend to do, what they need, what problems are. And because it let us to understand the context, and we need to understand the context before to do whatever. So I think that, in my opinion, the most important thing is to be humble, to be quiet at the first stage, and understand the context, and after that find how we can help to the coaches, to the players, to the strength and conditioning coach.
Yeah, really good. Thank you very much, Enrique. Well, there hasn't been any other questions come in, but I know Enrique shared his Twitter. So if you wanted to reach out to him to ask any questions directly, then feel free to do so. Sorry. I've also just put up a quick poll, so if you can take the time just before you jump off to rate the session, that would be fantastic. A big thank you again to Ryan, who I think is still with us, and Enrique. Two great presentations, I'm sure you all agree. And thank you very much for your time. That's the last of the Catapult Performance webinar series, so we'll stop bugging you with emails from this point. But thank you very much for all of you who've joined any of the series so far, and hope you stay safe in this difficult time for everybody.